Coming up on Business Incorporated today, Nigeria plans to team up with Cameroon to hammer out cocoa premium pricing. And the IMF gives Ghana's economy a clean bill of health with GDP growth of 7% in 2019. Plus, Equatorial Guinea says currency caps will hurt the country's energy prospects. Welcome to the program on Channel Television. I am Bosin Namafai. Let's get today's show started. We begin with the markets here on the African continent, where most of the bourses were in the green territory. Intraday, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the GST All-Share Index, jumped 1.13%, one of the biggest jump on the African continent. Here in Nigeria, the Nigerian Stock Exchange Broad Index was 0.45% in the green territory. Look at the flip side of that, and you can see most the Egyptian market 0.84%, reading 14,302 for the final trading day of the week, Thursday, and the Kenyan Stock Exchange also finishing looking very nicely. But let's check in with the Middle Eastern markets, where we're looking at the Qatar Stock Exchange right now. You can see that on your screen, 0.29%, reading 10,227. The Saudi market was a little bit in the water, 0.26%. The big story for Qatar was the National Bank, whose shares up 1.2% after a very strong third quarter earnings. Flip that over and you're looking at the Abu Dhabi market in the green, 0.4%, and the Dubai financial market just about 0.02%. Let's talk about the European stock market trading higher this Friday morning as positive signals emerge from trade negotiations between the US and China and a meeting between British and Irish leaders over Brexit. My colleague for DWTV on behalf of Channel Television, Ulrich Batz, is standing by at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange to give us a bit of a more sense into some clarity in some of the big stories that has been for the day and the week ending today. Good afternoon, Ulrich. It's good to see you.
Good afternoon. Good to be back. Thank you.
Good to be back on the show, you and I. So, hopes are flaring up in the markets today, the first trading day after the negotiations between US and China. What's the comment people are making right now? How are the markets in Europe trading this development?
Yeah, the markets are trading very much higher on hopes for the trade to get into a better channel. I talked to one person here in the market, and he said that basically it's one word from Trump. And when you look at the DAX behind me, the DAX is doing especially well in Europe. It's going up by about 2%. Paris and Milan are going up by more than 1%, and London lagging a little bit behind, but still gaining 0.5%. And it's basically one message from the U.S. president. Namely, he said that the talks so far, he meant the talks that happened yesterday in Washington between the negotiators from China and the U.S. were going along really well. And that was basically enough. That's basically the whole story this Friday. But there's so much at stake here. And, of course, next week, new tariffs might take effect. They're scheduled to take effect. They might not if these talks go really well. So there's so much at issue here. But it's basically that one message that set the market kicking upwards. And you also mentioned already, Bosun, the talks between the Irish leader and the UK's Boris Johnson. And that's also strongly reinforcing this trend today.
Yes, but if we step into the corporate world, the SAP company, what's this leadership change all about? A new CEO and who is stepping down and who is stepping into this big company? Bring us up to speed, Ulrich.
Yes, it was a very, very surprising message. It came at about midnight German time, and ad hoc, that is an immediate news message from SAP, second largest software maker in the world. Bill McDermott stepping down as chief executive. He's been in that post for 10 years, the first 4 years, together with Jim Hagemann-Snabe, who's now supervisory board chairman at Siemens. And basically this duo, and especially in the last years, Bill McDermott is credited with the success story at SAP. It's gone up and up. Bill McDermott has taken it into the cloud business, which has proven very lucrative. He did this at quite an early age. It was a bit of a rocky going with moving into the cloud, but SAP is now making bundles of money with that. And of course, also having lots of customers dependent on its corporate use intended software. The SAP share in McDermott's 10-year tenure going up by about 285%. That's almost quadrupling the share price in that time. Funny enough, I don't see this very often. People satisfied with the CEO and his performance, pleased, but the share also rising when he announces his departure, and that was the case. The share is going up by about 8% today, by far the largest gainer in the DAX, but analysts say this has, I think, mainly to do with the quarterly results for the third quarter. Analysts say much better than they expected. SAP making very serious money. The successors in place, and this speaks for the fact that this was planned ahead of time. It came as a surprise for markets, for reporters like me, but analysts say this was planned. McDermott probably having waited for the good time to have his exit and seeing it now. The successors are on board already. They're board members. They're Christian Klein and Jennifer Klein. I have to look a bit. Jennifer Jones, because she's an American. And she will be the first woman, in fact, as a co-CEO to head up a DAX company. So also an important message to investors and to the society at large.
Yes, a very big message. But I'm sure, Ulrich, that corporate news, including earnings, will be part of your focus for next week from the German market, isn't it?
For certain. There are the banks all along the American banks, practically the big names, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and also, yeah, I think I mentioned them all. But it's not only the financials, it's also the non-financials. IBM will be coming, Johnson & Johnson. And then you'll also have big news from the economic front. We have the IMF and the World Bank meeting in Washington starting next week. And the new IMF chief, Georgieva, will be holding her first World Economic Outlook. And people will, I think, be looking forward both to the numbers there of that updated outlook. That's very important. That usually moves the market in some way. But I think they'll also be looking at Georgieva's performance in this new role and assessing, is she the woman to steer this important institution into the future as a basic pin for assuring world economic stability. And speaking of world economic stability, also more news from the Fed expected next week, the Beige Book, which is also always a market mover, Bosun.
Definitely. Of course, it's going to be very heavy between New York and Washington next week with those meetings and the Beige Book. Thank you so much from the Fed. Thank you so much, Ulrich Batz. Have a great weekend and see you pretty soon here on the program. My colleague,